War often makes for unusual bedfellows, from countries that would otherwise be enemies becoming allies to everyday citizens achieving incredible feats of sabotage. One of the most unexpected allies, however, to join the battle against the Axis forces wasn't a country or even an army, but a ghost train. On the 2nd of September 1944, orders were carried out to move roughly 1,370 prisoners from Saint-Gilles prison in Brussels to Germany. Despite Belgium still being under German occupation, Allied forces were closing in, and it was realised that many of the resistance members and political figures who'd been taken prisoner would soon be released once the Allied forces took control. Not wanting them to fall into enemy hands, it was decided that the prison would be emptied and its occupants would be transported to Germany, where they'd either remain imprisoned or sent to a camp for execution. At the nearby railway station, 32 cattle vans had been shunted to a platform and a large number of SS soldiers were patrolling the station. Quick note, most sources refer to the prison vans as being either boxcars or cattle vans. It is possible, however, that they might have been French 40 and 8 cars built to transport troops and horses, as these were used by Germany to transport prisoners and do greatly resemble cattle vans. For the sake of ease, however, I'll refer to them as cattle vans for the rest of the video. It was around 6 in the morning when Assistant Station Master Michel Petit got word that Saint-Gilles prison was being emptied, and it didn't take long for him to realise what the guards and the cattle vans were for. Being an active member of the resistance, Petit wasted little time spreading word of what the Germans were doing. Plans were formulated to attack the station to free the prisoners, but the number of enemy soldiers meant it would have most certainly ended in catastrophe. Then the railwaymen had an idea. Given how quickly the Allies were advancing, they knew that if they could just delay the train for long enough, the prisoners had a good chance of being freed, and so plans for a day of confusion and delay were put into motion. The resistance already had a head start. The vents on the cattle vans were initially closed, but an assistant manager at the station opened them despite threats from the soldiers, so that the prisoners could have some fresh air after the vans became stuffy and unbearably hot. Not only that, but the open vents allowed prisoners to whisper messages and pass notes between the vans. Technical Inspector Piet was asked to slow down the arrival of the locomotive that was to pull the prisoner train, and it wasn't long before every available engine in the yard was recalled to the depot. Eventually, the train's convoy number was given to Petit, which made things much easier as it meant the railway workers knew exactly which engines were being requested to pull the train, and thus which engines they had to sabotage. Spare parts went missing, points became jammed, drivers were calling in sick, and unnecessary extra checks were being made. By 9 AM, a Type 33 locomotive became available and was requested to pull the train, but mysteriously broke down before it was able to be coupled up. Another engine was found, but its lubrication piping was damaged, then another, but its air brakes weren't working. Eventually, the Germans got fed up with the constantly broken engines, and so several German mechanics were ordered to get something in working order. An engine was quickly repaired and pressed into service, but miscommunication caused it to get lost in the marshalling yard, where it remained for the rest of the day. At noon, a freight train arrived, which was quickly reassigned to pull the prison train. But yet another error ended up with it in a yard on the other side of Brussels. Eventually, an engine was found, but no driver or fireman was available to operate it. One driver said it was the end of his shift and went home. When the replacement driver arrived, he requested to pick up his wages first, as was custom on a Saturday, before vanishing. A driver was eventually found and ordered to the engine. He tried to stall and take his time, but realising that the Germans weren't buying the act, he deliberately fell off the engine's footplate and wouldn't stop yelling in pain until he was taken away. Having had enough of the increasingly obvious sabotage attempts, a group of SS guards found driver Louis Vergel and fireman Leon Pochet and marched them to Type 12 locomotive number 1202 at gunpoint. The engine was readied and coupled to the prison train along with a van carrying several German machine gunners. 3 guards stood on the footplate with guns pointed at the driver and fireman to ensure they wouldn't try anything. Luckily, the guards knew little about railway operations and the stations ahead were ready to cause more frustration. The prison train finally left the station at 4:50 PM, only to immediately drive straight into the marshalling yard. In the confusion, the train was redirected south to Vorst Station, where the station master had accepted an incoming freight train on the main line. The prison train was forced into a siding while the freight train was split up and shunted around. Gerdessen and Porcher took the opportunity to refill the engine with water, while another flak wagon equipped with an anti-aircraft gun was connected to the end of the train. It was nearly an hour before the train moved again, stopping in Saarbeck marshalling yard. The signal was set to clear, but Gerdessen stopped the train as he wanted to request a pilot engine to help him through the yard. The guards, however, forced him back to the controls, with one of them warning, "Maschine kaputt, du kaputt." It was about 6 PM and the train that should have been in Germany by now had only just left Brussels. The train was made to continue on to Mechelen, where it stopped once again, this time by a signal along the line. It remained stationary for a while until an impatient guard made the driver continue despite the signal being set to stop. Finally, in Mechelen, the train stopped once more, but this time for good reason. The signals were broken due to damage caused by Allied bombings, and Gerdessen had to use a nearby phone to call ahead to check if the line was clear. Initially, the guards were skeptical, but upon realising he was telling the truth, 2 guards escorted him to a phone while 1 remained with Porcher. During the call, both men had left the vapour release open to help drain the engine of water. Once the train set off again, they requested that they stop and refill at Mechelen. Both driver and fireman knew that the water towers in Mechelen Yard were out of order due to Allied bombings, and so by the time they arrived at 11:40 PM, they had to be diverted to Mausen Station, where the train remained for the rest of the night. The crew filled the engine with water while the station master kept the train from leaving. By this point, everyone was exhausted. The engine crew had been stalling and operating the locomotive for over 8 hours with guns pointed at their backs, the German guards had practically been awake and alert all day, and the prisoners were still crammed in the vans and running out of food and water. At midnight, gunshots and explosions could be heard in the distance from approaching Allied forces. The prisoners were hopeful, but an SS officer warned them that 3 of them at random would be lined up and shot should any of them try to escape. By dawn, the fighting had ceased, and the Germans were anxious to get out of Belgium. 1202 was shunted to the front of the prison train, and the convoy set off again at 5:30 in the morning. The Type 12s were built to pull fast, light trains, and so it only made it to Mechelen when its wheels began to slip, and wouldn't you know it, its sanding gear failed too. Not wanting to waste more time, a Type 1 Pacific locomotive was ordered to take over the train. The Type 1's driver was filled in by Gerdessen on the nature of the train, and both agreed to return to Brussels, which was made much easier thanks to the Germans believing it to be dangerous to travel north towards the Netherlands or directly east through Leuven due to resistance activity. As the locomotive had to shunt around while in Mausen, the anti-aircraft gun was positioned at the front of the train behind the locomotives. While waiting to depart, the guards requested that the gun be moved to the rear of the train, to which the driver happily obliged. Once the signal was given, both the Type 1 and 12 set off for Saarbeck with the prison train. Unfortunately for the guards, the driver had forgotten to couple the flat carriage, and so the train quickly raced off without it. Back at Brussels, German forces were in a panic trying to flee from the Allies, and the railway workers were more than happy to slack off and take an easy Sunday at their expense, until news came that the prison train would be arriving back at Klein Island Station. Knowing German commanders would immediately send the train away again, everyone who could helped further sabotage engines, points, signals, and anything that could cause further confusion. By the time the train arrived at 10:15, everyone under German command was frantic. All available engines had been sent elsewhere, and the only one left was reserved for a Red Cross train. The prison train had only been in the station a few minutes when the driver of the Type 1 was ordered at gunpoint to couple his engine onto a commander's train. Gerdessen and Porcher felt it best to make their engine unusable and themselves scarce. and so Scherer stepped off the footplate pretending to inspect the engine before running away at the first opportunity. 2 of the guards had abandoned the engine once it arrived, leaving one still pointing a gun at Pochet. Pochet set about looking busy while discreetly dropping the engine's fire, and when the right moment arose, he ran off too. The yard signals were all set to clear, meaning no trains were stopping at the station for German command to commandeer. With no crew and 1202's fire now gone out, the prison train wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't long before officials were in the office of the German station commander, negotiating the release of the prisoners. The commander was adamant that the prisoners be moved back to Saint-Gilles, but eventually agreed to let them all free apart from one van that carried captured Allied airmen, who were to remain as prisoners of war. At 12:30 p.m, orders to free the prisoners reached the station, and the doors of the cattle vans were opened. Everyone was quite thankful to be able to stretch their legs and return home to their families. It's not clear what exactly happened to the van containing the airmen who were to be prisoners of war, but it's likely that they too were turned free, as by 7 p.m. that same day, the Allied forces finally reached Brussels and liberated Belgium's capital. Both Scherer and Pochet were effectively knighted for their actions, and railwaymen who told stories of the event came to refer to 1202 and its antics as the Ghost Train. There have been countless examples of railway sabotage and espionage during the Second World War, but few are quite as comical in retrospect as this one. Just goes to show then that not every ghost train is malicious or full of spooky spirits, some of them save lives. Subscribe for more.